I've been talking about this book, The Greatest Salesman in the World, and there's another passage in here that I think is really good. It's a fable about a guy who comes across these scrolls of wisdom to teach him principles of behavior for becoming the greatest salesman in the world. And it's not really about sales. It's about, developing, yourself and, principles for how to live and how to treat other people. But the first scroll, the first scroll of wisdom that he comes across, the very first sentence of the first scroll is, "Today I begin a new life." And, it made me think of, this concept of like forgiveness. Like I went to Catholic school for 12 years and, so I'm quite familiar with the concept of like forgiveness and penance. But it made me think about it from like a psychological perspective. And like, if you're not familiar, go to the priest and you recount your sins, and then he tells you to do some prayers. And then like, on behalf of God, he's like, your sins will be forgiven. So it's like, a clean slate, right? It's a totally clean slate. And so, I was thinking about this from like not a religious perspective, but like a secular psychological perspective, the benefit of this concept of forgiveness, because it's like, okay, you have these bad things that happen in your past, okay, and you confess your sins, you say you're sorry, you make amends, by praying or whatever, and then it's like you're done. Then you're released. You're released from this like self-imposed psychological prison that you hold yourself in because you keep remembering, you keep recalling these bad things that happen. And I was talking about this the last couple of days, where it's like, a lot of times, we think about, we think that we live in the future, in the sense that, you have these goals and you're always striving towards these goals. But, in this book, Psycho-Cybernetics that I've been talking about, the author was like, well, actually, you live in your past more than you think, because it's like, it's our memories that we keep, conjuring up, particularly memories of bad things. Like we keep replaying them over and over in our minds, and it's like the replaying of these things and like the emotional response, the negative emotional response, and like the personal like, psychological flogging that we give ourselves because of these bad things that happened in the past, it affects our present and it affects the direction that we go, in the future. And so when I read this thing about like, today I begin a new life, and it made me think of like forgiveness and stuff, I was like, wow, there's like, again, just from a purely secular psychological perspective, I was like, there's a very real benefit to this idea of forgiveness and washing away your sins, because it's a total clean slate. And, the other day I talked about how it's like, okay, it's really hard to just say, all right, I'm going to stop thinking about bad things that happened in the past. It's like really hard, right? Practically impossible for any of us. And so I was like, well, maybe if you reframe, these bad, I think I was talking about this yesterday, maybe if you like reframe these things so that you can look at the benefit that came out of these negative experiences, whenever you conjure up these negative experiences, you can focus on the benefit instead of the bad thing that happened. But this idea of forgiveness, the idea of like self-forgiveness, like forgiving yourself for certain things, is also really powerful. And it might be really beneficial, to think about how you might be able to do this in your own life, where it's like, maybe instead of, trying to block out bad memories, and maybe instead of, or in addition to trying to reframe bad memories to focus on, anything that positive that could have come out of it, maybe consider the possibility of trying to just like forgive yourself for things that, happened in the past. Again, from a, specifically from a secular, like non-religious perspective. I mean, forgiveness has, a lot of religious things that are meaningful for people, but just from a psychological perspective, it might be like a really powerful thing to try, and maybe it works for some things and maybe it doesn't. But, this is what I was thinking of when I read this, and I was like, wow, this could be like a really powerful, psychological, interpersonal technique to try to release the hold that, some of our past experiences have on us. So that was that. And then he goes on and he talks about habits. All right. So like these scrolls, one of the major one major focus of the wisdom in these scrolls is to create good habits, good habits of thought, good habits of behavior, in order to do things that would be necessary to help one become the greatest salesman in the world. And you know, it says there's a part here, it's like, good habits are the key to all success. Bad habits are the unlocked door to failure. It's like, okay, fine. But then he goes on, and he says, only a habit can subdue another habit. Okay, and I was thinking about this, and I was like, you know, I did a video a while back on Atomic Habits by James Clear. It's a really good book. I recommend you read it. And, you know, I think it's common to think about our habits as like habits of behavior. You know, it's like, oh, you know, you eat too much junk food and you want to have a healthy diet, so you have to create a healthy habit of eating, you know, whatever, or exercise or whatever it is. But like, it's also true, we absolutely have habits of thought. You know, I call it psychological muscle memory. Like you have muscle memory, you know, for athletics or whatever, like certain things that you do. But we have psychological muscle memory, which is essentially like habits of thought. Okay, and it's like, so often I think if you don't change your habit of thought, you're probably not going to change your habit of behavior, right? And so I was thinking about the power of habits, like behavioral habits. One thing is you know, yes, you know, creating a positive behavioral habit can help eliminate a negative behavioral habit, but it's also, I think, creating a positive behavioral habit can help, what do you call it, like get rid of or overcome negative psychological habits, like psychological habits of thought, where it's like, you know, I think in some ways, I think it's much easier to change our habits of behavior than it is to change our habits of thought. And particularly, and this goes back to like all the psychology books I talked about before, it's like often our habits of thought are ingrained into our sense of self, our identity, okay? And so it's like we're really psychologically apprehensive about giving up these habits of thought because in some way they define us. They're like part of like our sense of self. And so I was thinking of the power of behavioral habits, like good behavioral habits, in terms of not just replacing bad behavioral habits, but helping us to regroove psychological habits of thought. Anyway, you know, maybe think about that. Maybe you know, consider the possibility that your habits of thought might be really hard to change, but if you can generate good habits of behavior, they might sort of like, in a backwards, reverse fashion, regroove habits of thought. I was just thinking about that. Hopefully that might help. Okay, and then I started reading this book, Autobiography of Red, Anne Carson. And just in the introduction, she's talking about, it's like a poet from the 7th century BC, all right? And she mentions Homer, who comes before this historical poet. But she's talking about the use of adjectives in poetry, and in particular Homer's poetry. And you know, she talks about how Homer would describe children as bruiseless, right? Bruiseless, not like small, young, you know, delicate, frolicsome, bruiseless children. And I thought about like, wow, that's such a powerful adjective because it conjures up more than just description. Right? And then she has another example where Homer describes this one person as ordeal strong, right? And I think that's beautiful. I think it's beautiful because it conjures up, you can just imagine this guy is like, he became tough because he went through all these really tough life experiences, you know, and it's more than just, the courageous or, you know, whatever, the willful. It's like the ordeal strong. It was really beautiful. And I bring this up because, well, a couple things. One, I started reading Dante's Inferno last night because I was like, man, you know, some of these adjectives are so beautiful. I want to read like really, you know, some really great, you know, poetry and verse. But, you know, it's funny because it made me think of, you know, these are just adjectives, right? They're just adjectives. They're really small little things, but like the amount of power and beauty that a skillful poet, right, can add to the description of a noun, like a person or whatever, through these beautiful, powerful adjectives is really amazing. It really speaks to, it's like when you achieve a certain level of mastery, it's like you can do the simplest things beautifully. Like, and it's like people can tell. It's like you don't have to do like crazy, difficult things. It's like the simple things that you can do. You demonstrate just how masterful it is. And it was like, I will be speaking a lot about like beauty of language. And tomorrow, certainly, I'll talk about Dante's Inferno. I just read the first couple pages. But, it's funny. It made me think of, I mean, totally random, right? This guy, Billy Mitchell, who he's famous for being the first person ever to score a perfect score in Pac-Man, okay? Like the video game from the 1980s. Whether or not you played it, everybody's heard of Pac-Man, and probably everybody's played, at least the first board or two. And, it's funny, I'll put a link in the description below. There's one YouTube video where it's like a multi-hour video. He goes from the first screen all the way to what's called like the kill screen at the end, where it doesn't really matter. But he starts off on the first board. Okay, this is Billy Mitchell. He dedicated years of his life to becoming a true master at Pac-Man. And this brings up another issue. But anyway, if you watch, I recommend muting the video, because these like dudes are just talking about like Pac-Man related stuff and can be kind of annoying. But if you just watch how Billy Mitchell plays the first board of Pac-Man, it's like, he doesn't play Pac-Man the way you or I play Pac-Man. I mean, we'll like try to get the power pellet, when the ghosts are kind of nearby, and you try to get all the ghosts, and maybe you get the cherry, if you're like nearby or whatever. And if you just survive the board without dying, you're happy. No, like Billy Mitchell, when he does this, you can see how masterful he is. He is patient. It's like the poise of like his Pac-Man character, and in the way he manipulates the ghosts. And it's really like his patience that really, really speaks to his mastery of the thing. And it's board one, right? Most of us with a little bit of practice like can get past board one. But when he gets past board one, it's like you can tell this dude is a master. But it also made me think of, like a couple videos ago, I did one on Mr. Beast, okay? And I talked about one of the 4 things that I got from watching these videos, these interviews with him, was that how professional approach he took to YouTube, right? There was like, I keep saying there's like no stone unturned. I mean, he examined every little thing about the business of YouTube and the technique of making videos and everything. It's really impressive. It's really impressive. Dedicated, many years of his life. He's only 25, so let's say like the last 10 years. But just a very professional approach. And Billy Mitchell playing Pac-Man took the same thing. I mean, it's like, you watch other videos and he talks about, it's like, oh yeah, it takes like 47 seconds to get through, board number 7 or whatever it is. I mean, it's like he knows everything about, and exactly like the character of how the ghosts, it's like, well, when one ghost is nearby, how they play off of each other. He knows all this stuff because he took a really, really professional approach. And so just watching this video, one, it made me reflect on like Mr. Beast's professional approach, but 2, it was like, just like these adjectives, like where, you can tell somebody's mastery, even in the simple things. Well, it's like, just like Billy Mitchell playing Pac-Man. It's like really, really masterful. I recommend you watch just like the first, like maybe 2 or 3 minutes of him playing. You understand what I'm talking about. And then I'll put a link below to another thing. So I've been like a ballroom dancer for 20 years. I love ballroom dancing. Not the way I love reading and writing. That's completely different. But when I started dancing like 20 years ago, my hero was this guy, Luca Baricchi. And he and his wife were 2-time world champions. And there's this video of them doing the waltz, okay? And there's going to be a link below. And just watch it. It's beautiful. It's to this very slow waltz. Sarah Brightman singing Lascia Ch'io Pianga, probably not pronouncing it correctly. But for those of you who are not familiar with waltz tempo, it's a very slow waltz. And when you dance very slowly, like a lot of things, like martial arts or whatever, it takes a lot of skill and precision of movement and muscular control and balance. But the thing that really resonates with me with watching these 2 dance, which this is probably the most beautiful waltz I've ever seen, is that it's really basic figures. And you might not know this if you're not familiar with ballroom dancing, but these are like some of the most basic figures that even, complete novice dancers will learn. But they do it beautifully. I mean, it's so exquisitely beautiful. Please watch that, even if you're not really into ballroom dancing. It's so beautiful. But again, it's this theme of like, you know, when you achieve a certain level of mastery, you can do simple things really, really beautifully. And this really resonated with me. You know, I'm sure, or I hope that, you know, you have this experience in your life where you can appreciate, you know, things like that. But I point out these two examples in the videos below, Pac-Man and the waltz, so you can just see. Again, it's so beautiful. And tomorrow I'll talk more about like the beautiful use of language in Dante's Inferno. Let's see. Oh, okay. And then this is just, I read this book a couple weeks ago or whatever, An Unquiet Mind by Kay Jameson. Pretty famous book in the field of psychology. She suffered and continues to suffer, I guess, from manic depressive disorder. And it really manifested in, I guess, her teens or whatever. And she went on college, grad school, professional in the field of psychology and psychiatry and things like that. So anyway, there's one part in this book where maybe she was a grad student. She had an undergrad student that she was mentoring in a class or something like that. And he was blind, okay? And whenever she would have office hours specifically for him, he'd show up to her office and he'd have his guide dog. And she said how the guide dog would, you know, sit down at his ankles and was, you know, wonderful and everything. And they have a really good tutoring session or whatever it was. And then he would go. And then, you know, after a while, like after a couple weeks or, you know, a couple months or whatever into the semester, she felt comfortable enough to ask him about being blind. Because again, she, you know, she was suffering from manic depressive disorder. And, you know, so it was the idea of like, you know, a handicap or whatever is like the right word you want to use, but like, you know, something that's like limiting, you know, in a way that's like, it affects you every single day. So she felt like after a few months that she was close enough and, you know, on a comfortable enough level that she could ask him about his experience being blind. And she felt after a while, after talking to him, that that she had a pretty good idea. She felt she had a pretty good idea of what it was like to be blind. And then one time, maybe towards the end of the semester, the student asked her to meet, if she would meet him in the blind reading room. And she was like, yeah, sure. You know, so, you know, she goes there and she said when she first starts to go into the blind reading room, she stops because it's all dark, right? And students are in there studying. Obviously, they're blind. They don't need the light. They're, you know, reading with their hands. And it was like, she was like, at that moment, she realized that she didn't know a thing about being blind. It was like she thought she did, right? Because, you know, she understood it at, you know, an intellectual level. But this really hit her at like a visceral level. It was like, oh, there's like a whole nother level of understanding of, you know, what it's like to be this other person that she didn't appreciate until she walked into the reading room and all the lights were off, right? So, I mean, to me, it really spoke to, like, you know, it's very easy, of course, to see the world, you know, from our own perspective. You know, but it's like everybody's different, right? You know, like, sorry, every once in a while I get this way, kind of bubbles up, you know, and so it's like, it's very easy to see things from our own perspective, you know, but it's like, we really have no clue what it's like to be somebody else, even if we think we do, right? And so it just, you know, this is one of these things that resonated with me. It's like, you know, maybe just remind yourself every once in a while that even though you think you might have a really good handle on what it's like to be somebody else, probably you don't, right? And so it's like, just as one of the messages I say in this from psychology is like, try to not be your own worst enemy, try to go a little bit easy on yourself. It's like, maybe, you know, cut other people some slack too, you know, once in a while. Because they might be going through a lot of stuff that you know, don't know. Anyway, I don't know why I get like this. And okay, so that was all, you know, and I just wanted to say, like, I talk about this random stuff. Like, I really think, you know, my path forward, you know, for at least the kind of near-term future is like just sharing these things that resonate with me that might seem kind of random, just things I read or whatever. And it's like there's a reason for it, or like a potential benefit to you. And the potential benefit is like, you never know when somebody's going to say something. And I'll talk about this in the next couple of days because I have a lot of examples where you never know when something somebody says or something you read or a thought that you have is going to trigger something inside, right? And it's going to launch something that might become something you're truly passionate about. You know, and again, I'll talk about examples that I read in the newspaper about this. So, you know, it's like I don't try to come up with a theme, you know, to these things. One, because I think it's better, you know, a better way for me to share if I can just share kind of like extemporaneously things that just come to mind. But it's also like, it's possible maybe something I say or something somebody else says, some random thing that might trigger something inside of you and then launch a new direction of like passion and fulfillment that, you know, maybe you wouldn't necessarily have known unless somebody said something that triggered it. So anyway, have a wonderful day, and bye.